warmth and the love that she shared with us our whole lives. She was 79 years old. She was such a role model for all of us. Deeply believed in understanding other cultures. I think it's the reason why I went into anthropology and journalism. Listened intently to everyone. Traveled the world from Iran to Turkey, from Israel. Well, Israel she had been many times. My father and her met in a Hebrew-speaking camp where they weren't allowed to speak English when they met, together with Noam Chomsky and Carol Chomsky. They were their bunkmates. At least my father and Noam were bunkmates. My father would always say, how's Noam Chomsky? I said, Dad, he's a linguist. It's Chomsky. To show my mother's complexity, one year she was voted funniest girl at the camp, and the next year she was voted most serious. But her love of literature and books, she taught women's history and literature at local community colleges to firefighters and policemen, to civil servants who would go to get extra credits to increase their salaries. And they think, what's easier than a little chick lit, right? Chick literature. Read it, it'll be easy, get a higher salary. And there was my mother introducing them to Toni Morrison, to Virginia Woolf. And soon the firefighter would bring his wife, the policeman would bring his daughter. It was in the 70s, understanding what it meant for women to be expanding their horizons and saying, oh, that's what she's talking about. And her classes, by the end of every semester, would be filled to capacity with whole families, which is why she then decided to go into social work and went back to school and got a degree in social work and worked with people in communities and families to help them. But her traveling, one of her last trips was to Palestine. And she went there with a group, I think it was Global Exchange. She had a Palestinian tour guide. And I can't remember if it was Jericho or if it was Bethlehem. But they had worked out with the tour guide had worked out with the soldiers they could pass through the checkpoint. But when they came to the checkpoint, the soldiers, of course, said no to the Palestinian tour guide, until my mother came forward. She spoke a kind of classic Hebrew, as if, here, these people could be her grandchildren. And she said something like, part the way. And the entire army at that point separated and allowed the group to travel through. The Palestinian tour guide put his arm around my mother and said, I'm sticking with you. And that has been my brother's and my philosophy all of our lives. We stuck with her. And she certainly talked to the doctors, even in the recovery room in the hospital after surgery, when everyone else seemed to, was unconscious. My mother remained conscious. She'd come out of surgery and she'd look up at the doctor as we all gathered round and she'd whisper, 3,000, 3,000. What, Mom? What did you say? 3,000. The doctor leans forward. What, Mrs. Goodman? What did you say? She looks at him in his eyes and she says, 3,000. The Chinese figured out 3,000 years ago how to manage pain. Why haven't you figured this out yet? Yeah, we'll stick with her. And she is such an important model for me as I go forward in my life, and for her friends who were her community. And it was just my great honor that I could bring her this book in the hospital, Breaking the Sound Barrier, just before she died, and she could see the dedication to my mother, Dari Goodman, the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Just one last thing. As one doctor taught me and taught our family something that I do want to share with others, because out of terrible things come remarkable revelations. At the end of our time at Mount Sinai, we found a doctor named Dr. Diane Meyer, who was a leader of the palliative care movement in this country, palliative health care. I first discovered her when I was sitting next to my mother in the hospital reading a Times op-ed, one of those paid-for ads. And it said, what patients want most is 1, time with their doctor, and 2, how to deal with pain. I said, this is the place we want to be. And it was signed by Dr. Diane Meyer, Mount Sinai Hospital. Unfortunately, we're in the hospital that she was describing, and it wasn't following through. But we called her, and she was who took us on that terrible journey at the end, and actually made it extremely rewarding and meaningful. She taught us how you speak at the end of life to someone that you've cherished all your life and understood you were losing. And she said, there are 5 things that you want to say. She said, try to say in one conversation or another, try to say thank you, forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, and goodbye. We have to respect life in all its forms, as well as the transition at the end of life, and what that means. And we need a healthcare system in this country that takes you from the beginning and to the end, and helps us through these very difficult passages. Well, on the issue of overall health care, and when people are alive, how they remain alive, I've written a lot about that. But one way I thought to communicate with popular culture in this country is to talk about the people who represent, for example, a system for health care for all that you wouldn't normally think about. Well, imagine the scene. America, 2009, 45,000 people have died in 1 year, an average of hundreds a day. Who's killing them? What's taking them out? To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, you know, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism is not the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. 45,000 people a year die as a result of lack of health care. And it's not terrorism. Maybe the president's solution then is not Jack Bauer, but the man who plays him. You know who the star of 24 is. Kiefer Sutherland, one of the most famous actors in America. Well, his family has very deep connections to healthcare reform, in Canada, that is. Sutherland's the grandson of the late Tommy Douglas. His mother is Helen Douglas, the actress. His father, Donald Sutherland. His grandfather is Tommy Douglas. Someone asked him recently, a journalist, how will you fill your father, Donald Sutherland's shoes? And he said, it's not my father I'm concerned about, it's my grandfather, Tommy Douglas, who is the pioneering Canadian politician credited with creating the modern Canadian healthcare system. As a youth, Tommy Douglas almost lost his leg. A doctor agreed to treat him if he could use him as an example to medical students that they could observe. As an adult, Douglas saw the impact of widespread poverty caused by the Great Depression. He soon became the premier of Saskatchewan and pioneered a number of progressive policies. His biggest battle, for which he's best remembered, is the creation of universal health insurance, also known as Medicare. It passed in Saskatchewan in 1962 after a 23-day strike of doctors in Canada against it, led by the U.S. American Medical Association. They were afraid it might spread the contagion to the United States. It passed in '62, and it was so successful in Saskatchewan that it was adopted across Canada. While Tommy Douglas was fighting for health insurance in Canada, a similar battle was raging here in the United States, resulting in the passage of Medicare and Medicaid, giving guaranteed single-payer health care to senior citizens and the poor. Rush Limbaugh says 24 is one of his favorite shows. He's even visited the set. Well, he should learn from his real-life actor who plays his hero, Jack. Limbaugh and his cohorts may find that truth is not as satisfying as fiction. In 2004, a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation poll named Tommy Douglas the greatest Canadian. And in 2000, in the Canadian province of Alberta, there was a rally to defend Canada's healthcare system, defending Canada's public single-payer system. Kiefer Sutherland addressed the crowd. He said, private healthcare does not work. America's trying to change their system. It's too expensive to get comprehensive medical care in the U.S. Why on earth are we going to follow their system here? I consider it a humanitarian issue. This is an issue about what is right and wrong, what is decent and what is not. Maybe Jack Bauer can save the day. You think about the people who act in this country, people who finally take a stand, sometimes not usually taking one, but when trouble comes to them, they stand up. Our previous book, Standing Up to the Madness, was about that. But in this book, in this book of columns over the last 3 years, I profiled many different people, some never suspecting one day they would rise up and take a stand. And I think about one, Tim DeChristopher. Those of you who are regular listeners or viewers of Democracy Now! know this young man. Well, we call the column Bush and the Monkey Wrench Guy, or One Man's Bid to Aid the Environment. Tim DeChristopher is an economics student at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. He just had finished his final exam before winter break. One of the exam questions was, if the oil and gas companies are the only ones who